Popular sovereignty. Popular sovereignty means the people have the power in the government. Okay? When our founders were creating a new framework for the United States, we had just come off a battle with Britain and a king who was very controlling and gave the people little to no power. So the first thing that the framers wanted to establish was a government ruled by the people. And we know this because we, the people of the United States, is the start of the U.S. Constitution. It's the start of the preamble. And it was very important to the framers that they made it known from the get-go that the people were the ones in charge of the government, not one person, not one branch of government. Okay, principle 2 is republicanism. Republicanism is the people exercise their power by voting. So we needed to establish a way for the people to have the power, because even back then it was very difficult for someone to get to the Capitol, and it would be nearly impossible now for all the people in the United States to have unlimited power. So what they did was they established a way for everyone to have a say, and they did that through voting. So now you can go to the polls, you should go to the polls when you turn 18, and you will vote for representatives. You will vote for something as local as your city and something as large as the President of the United States. You're voting for representatives to go for you and represent your feelings and views. Okay. The third principle is federalism. This is the power in the government is divided between the federal and state governments. Okay, so the Constitution has set up a way for our national or federal government to have some powers and our state government to have some powers. That way, the states don't become too powerful like they did under the Articles of Confederation, and the federal government doesn't become all powerful like the colonists had experienced under the King of England. The best way that I can illustrate federalism is by drawing a balancing scale, which is what you use in science to balance weights. So on a balancing scale, you want the federal and the state government to be equal. You don't want the federal government way up here while the state is way down here, or vice versa. Principle 4, separation of powers. Each branch has certain jobs. No one branch has all the powers. Okay, so the first Constitution that we have in the United States after the American Revolution were the Articles of Confederation. And under the Articles of Confederation, we established only one branch, the legislative branch. It did not work out the way we had hoped. We were trying to keep the government from becoming too powerful, and in doing that, we made them completely weak, and the states had all the power, and it just didn't work out. So when we came back to the Constitutional Convention to try and come up with a framework that would work for us, giving the federal government some powers, but not taking powers away from the state, we decided to establish 3 branches of government, which are the executive, judicial, and legislative. Executive, legislative, and judicial. We gave each branch certain powers that the other did not have. And for example, the legislative branch is in charge of making the laws. The executive branch is in charge of enforcing the laws. And the judicial branch is in charge of interpreting the laws. Each has a certain power, so one branch does not become all powerful. Going along with that is the next principle, checks and balances. Each branch can exercise checks or controls over the other branches. And the best way I've found to illustrate that is with an equilateral triangle. As you know, in your math class, we talked about an equilateral triangle. All 3 sides and no matter which way you turn the triangle, it's going to be balanced. And so that's kind of the idea behind checks and balances. No matter which branch you're looking at, they have certain powers, but they're not all powerful. For example, the executive branch will be the branch that chooses the judges for the Supreme Court. But the legislative branch has to vote and approve those, so they're checking each other. The legislative branch will create a law, but then it has to go to the executive branch, the president, and he has to approve it or he can veto it. While the judicial branch then will look at laws and decide whether they follow or fit within the constitutional guidelines. If not, then they're ruled unconstitutional. Okay. The sixth principle is limited government. This simply means that everyone must obey the laws. And since I'm not an artist, the best way for me to illustrate that was with a no sign. You see those, no smoking, no diving, and that type of thing. But everyone, from the top, the president, to your grandma, have to follow the same laws. That keeps anyone from becoming a tyrant like King George had become when the American colonies were under British control. Okay, the seventh principle is individual rights. These are our personal liberties and privileges. And I illustrated that by drawing the Bill of Rights, which is what we're going to talk about next. So there are two types of rights. There are unalienable rights, which are rights you're born with and no one should be denied, example, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And then there are individual rights that all people within the United States are promised by our Constitution and the Bill of Rights. The Bill of Rights are the first 10 amendments to the U.S. Constitution, created to protect our individual rights. An amendment simply means a change. So the first 10 amendments we're familiar with, we're going to get more familiar with. But, for example, Amendment 1, freedom of speech, press, petition, protest, and religion, that's all guaranteed to you under the First Amendment.
Ready? Today we're going to talk about the digestive system. And we're going to start out with our study of the gross anatomy of the digestive system by looking at some of the functions of the digestive system. So let's get started making a list of functions. I have 6 primary functions. And I can't help it. I have to draw you, even though I've got this lovely picture right here, I can use this picture. But you know what? We're going to get into the anatomy of all these parts and who these people are and what part is what in way more detail than we've got going on here. But I can't help it. I have to draw you a picture of your own digestive tube. Does this look familiar? You know it does. We did this, we drew this body when we were talking about epithelial tissue. Remember that? And remember how I had, oh, what is this? A smiling, happy mouth. And what is this? I'm gonna make it look like a sphincter. Dude, I'm not even gonna comment on that. That's your anus. This is your digestive tube. We're gonna name all the parts in this lecture, but I'm gonna draw you a picture of all the functions of the digestive system. And we're going to start with the first one, which is basically ingestion of food particles into the mouth. One of the jobs of the digestive system is to ingest food. That makes sense, doesn't it? Imagine that. And look, I even drew it for you. Guess what? Another function. Okay, I have to draw you a piece of food that came in. Another function of the digestive system is to digest the food. Really? True story. What is digestion? Well, basically, when you digest something, you break it down into littler parts. How great is this? Look, I'm even gonna label these. Ingestion, this was number 1. Digestion, this was number 2. I broke it down into pieces. In our digestive system, there are 2 ways that we break things down. We can break things down chemically, or we can break them down mechanically. That says mechanically. Of course it does. When you break something down chemically, you actually add a chemical to it, and the chemical breaks the chemical bonds in the original substance, creating smaller particles. That's what digestion is. When you break something down mechanically, you actually apply a force to break the particles apart. The end result is exactly the same. You start out with a big particle, you end up with lots of little particles, which again is the definition of digestion. A third thing that happens in the digestive system, I'm going to draw it in a different color. The digestive system, the whole system, moves substances through it. So it's called motility. But basically you're moving the particles through the GI tract. So look, I'm going to draw it like this. This is number 3. These particles move, and I'm going to try and make my little purple particles. They just move through the digestive tract. As we examine our entire system, we're going to see different parts of the tube, and we're going to name all those different parts of the tube. And we'll notice that different parts of the tube have different functions, like different things are happening in each of the parts, but we have to move the food through the tube in order to get from the start to the finish, which makes complete sense. We also have, I love this one. Another function is secretion. And it's probably a good idea. We're going to see secretion in lots of different scenarios. Secretion is when, like body cells, this is familiar to you, I know, epithelial cells lining the lumen of my digestive tube actually are producing substances, digestive chemicals, mucus, other enzymes, even sometimes some waste products are actually secreted into the digestive tubing. But when a substance is moved from the inside of the body into the outside, into the tube, that process is secretion. Are some of these familiar? They're totally functions of epithelial tissue, which is what the tubing is lined with. All right, number 5. Why are we doing all, why? Digestive system, why? Because you're hungry. Your cute little cells are starving. And so another function of the digestive system is absorption. Again, hopefully familiar, because this is actually a function of the epithelial tissues themselves. So once you break down your chemicals, your food, it gets digested into smaller pieces. What is the point of breaking it into smaller pieces in the first place? Well, your cells actually cannot use the hamburger directly. Your cells have to use the molecules in a hamburger. They can't make energy that you can use out of an entire hamburger. So break it down. Don't leave it in the tube, because guess where the tube is going? Yeah, that direction. Anything you leave in there is going to end up in your toilet, hopefully. It's your toilet. I don't really want to think about that too much. But anything that we want, we better get it out of there through the process of absorption. That's handy. And then anything that's left over, yes, the things that are left over. So we're gonna take the little purple squares, and anything that's left, we are going to eliminate. Elimination. Interestingly, the way we eliminate stuff in the digestive system is by going poo-poo through the anus. So literally, diarrhea. Diarrhea is awful because, and you can, it's a huge issue you if you have diarrhea and you can't get it under control, because you actually are going to poop out all your nutrients. You're going to eliminate all of that stuff before you can absorb the good stuff. You can't absorb the water back in, you can't absorb the nutrients back in, because you are pooping it out so fast that it is gone before you can absorb it. Those are all, that's a big picture overview of our functions of the digestive system, and now we're going to break down each individual part of our tube and talk about the unique features found in that part of the tube, and some of the anatomical features, and then some of the functions in each part.
Hello AP US History students. This is Mr. Goyette with National University Virtual High School reviewing for you some information you'll need to review for Unit 5 to prepare for the quizzes, exams, and of course the final we'll be taking this week as well for the course. I'm going to review some information for the 1920s, the Roaring 20s, everything from the Flappers to Consumer-Oriented Society, the American Family, Harding and Coolidge's presidencies. So let's begin with Consumer-Oriented Society of the 1920s. You can follow along with me on page 722 for this information. In the 1920s, consumer-oriented economy emphasized advertising, chain stores, and installment plans. They all became critical ways of keeping consumers coming back. There was increased marketing and purchasing. All of these things really created the consumer-oriented economy of the 1920s. The American family in the 1920s experienced declining birth rates. You can review this information on page 725. During his presidency, Warren G. Harding, the dark horse contender who won the election, the unexpected candidate, he lacked the capacity to govern very effectively, and he delegated a lot of his power. So he brought on some good team members into his cabinet, but he also brought on some members who proved to be scandalous members of his presidential cabinet. Harry Doherty and Albert Fall were involved in the Teapot Dome scandal, which occurred in Elk Hills, California, and Teapot Dome, Wyoming. Harding died of a heart attack before the verdict on Albert Fall actually went through, but Harding's popularity and his reputation were very negatively affected because he allowed some of his friends to abuse their power while he was in office. So during his presidency, Warren G. Harding allowed some of his friends to abuse their power. The end of the Red Scare came about as a result of its own extremism, as well as the actions of a few courageous public officials. Basically, Attorney General Mitchell Palmer falsely predicted a May Day revolution in 1920 that discredited the Red Scare. Palmer was rounding up 350, 600, 1,000 people at a time, and sending groups back on what he called what the press called the Soviet Ark. Palmer was a Quaker and a progressive who turned away from his liberal background and became a very conservative and jingoistic leader. He rounded up foreign-born radicals and sent them back. This was the fear of Bolshevism because of the Soviet Revolution, or the Bolshevik Revolution in the Soviet Union. There was labor unrest at the time, and the whole attitude of SOS, ship them out or shoot them, ship or shoot became the mantra for people who wanted to get rid of extremists or radicals in the United States because of the fear of the Red Scare. But the Red Scare itself fell apart because of its own extremism and because of the actions of a few courageous public officials. The National Origins Act of 1924, that's on page 737, you can read that information there. It was an attempt by some to establish racial purity as an immigration policy. The quota system was intended to reduce immigration from Southern and Eastern Europe, increase immigration from Northern and Western Europe, and ban immigration from Asia. The Scopes trial, or the Scopes monkey trial as it was called, indicated that traditional rural religious beliefs were stronger than ever, and certainly stronger than many in mainstream media had imagined. On page 746, you can review some of this information. Basically, traditional rural religious beliefs remained strong in the 1920s, and the aggressive fundamentalist sects grew rapidly during this time. President Calvin Coolidge, the man who liked to take a lot of naps and spent about maybe 6 hours a day working and spent the rest of it sleeping, was a Republican president who was friendly to American business. He once commented that the business of America is to do business, or something along those lines. The business of America is business. And you can review this information on page 738. The Democratic Party of the 1920s, review the bottom of page 740, gained new young voters among the city's ethnic groups. So the Democrats started to gain voting blocks that were would normally go to Republicans, especially among immigrant groups.